could you tell us about organisations that could provide funding for a performance, please?
Well, it depends on the kind of performance that you're doing.
So for us, it's a singing show, like
a singing
music
show.
performance.
There are so many, and the best place to look for them is the Arts Council website, and they have a really comprehensive list of different trusts and charities and all sorts of funding bodies that can give you some. Well, you can tailor make it for what's appropriate for the production that you're doing. So, because it wouldn't be a professional production, there would be certain funding bodies that wouldn't support you, but others that would. There are lots locally as well.
Yeah, like for example, I saw on the Arts Council website that they can't actually fund us because we're students.
Exactly.
And it's part of our course.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But if you were to set up a club or some sort of organisation, as a community organisation, then they could. But then the student thing would become irrelevant. So if you presented it as a community project, then you could apply to the Arts Council for funding. Yeah.
Great, yeah.
Locally, there are other funding bodies like Elmley. It's worth looking at Elmley. I don't know if they would support. Well, I mean, it's just worth trying if you look them up, or the City Council, to see if you were taking it into the public arena at all. Then it'd be worth seeing if there's small grants.
Is that Elmley the dairy products?
No.
No. Sorry.
No, Elmley, ELMLEY.
Right.
There's also another fund locally. It's run by somebody called Dave Barclay, and it's the Community Regeneration Trust Fund, I think. So that would be worth looking at. But all of these things, you'd have to be taking them out. As student productions, you're unlikely to get any
solid
public funding,
for that,
really. But what you could be looking at is getting private sponsorship.
Great. Do you want to take the next question?
When applying for funding, what would make a funding application more attractive?
Well, that is the million-dollar question. The funders need to make sure that what you're presenting them with ticks all the boxes in their list of criteria. So they need to make sure that the fit of your project matches their identity, really. Does that make sense? So for each funding body it would be different. It just depends who you're applying for or applying to. So you have to, the Arts Council would particularly want to see, just now, that what they want to see is audience development. So they want to see people who don't normally go to productions of any kind. They would want to see them coming in. The City Council would want to see that it benefits the city in some way. So the identity and the personality and the character of the funding body that you're applying to needs to see that it fits their personality, if you like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. It's similar to question 1, but kind of different as well, I think. What different types of funding are there available? So just different kind of types.
Well, you have public funding from lottery. The Arts Council, the grants for the arts, that's lottery money. So, for example, if you apply to somebody like Heritage Lottery Fund, if you're doing a heritage project, then Heritage Lottery are less keen if you are using Arts Council money as well for what we call match funding, because they're both coming out of lottery money. So it gets very political, and yet for some reason the Arts Council aren't bothered if you use Heritage Lottery money.
Can I just slip another quick sub-question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Heritage Lottery, what's this?
Heritage Lottery fund heritage projects. It's really that
what is
simple.
that?
So
What
in
does that
terms of
mean?
history, if it benefits and raises the profile of local history or national history, if it brings heritage and history to people who previously haven't been particularly aware of it.
Great. Yeah.
So very much to do with, you know, like if you were to do a project in the centre of town or in the old house, for example, in Hightown, if you were to do a project in there, then you could apply for heritage lottery money. You just have to show that in some way, even if it's an arts project, which they're less keen on, but there is a door there. You have to show that it really brings history to people who otherwise wouldn't be in touch with it, or presents it in a new way, makes it accessible.
Do you know anything about the Magna Carta project that's just been going on in Hereford, Estelle? Because
is it Heritage Lottery funded?
Well, I'm just wondering whether it was.
I'd be very surprised if it wasn't.
They worked in schools and then they brought the exhibition of photographs and artworks here, and we exhibited it in the department for a couple of months.
Yeah.
But I just wondered, because I know they must have been funded by somebody, because it was one woman who was running it. So maybe it could that would be the sort of project.
Exactly, absolutely. Yeah, they're very hot on education and accessibility.
Yeah,
definitely. And end result, Heritage Lottery are particularly keen on what have we got to show for it at the end.
Yes.
So it's sort of living legacy, if you like.
Question 4.
What does sponsorship entail?
Sponsorship is a completely different ball game. It's commercial, simply. So you would get sponsorship from businesses. You can have private sponsorship as well. Sometimes there are individual benefactors, but there is an exchange, and the exchange is not just your product, your production or your performance or whatever, but it's a benefit for them, so that they can, for example, if we use sponsors on Panto at the courtyard, then we have lots of sponsors. We have a main sponsor, which is Cargill's, the chicken people, and they get their branding on all of our publicity by way of exchange. So it's a commercial benefit, and also photo shoots. We'll do photo shoots with them, and the cast will go to the factory, and we'll incorporate some of their staff in the little film that we do and things like that. And then there are smaller sponsors. For example, the film that we did was entirely paid for by Cotswold Minis, and they paid for the film, and in exchange for that they got lots of profile, lots of publicity through us, and we used again their staff in the film. So there's always a commercial benefit for sponsors. Does that make sense? Alternatively, again at the courtyard you can get people sponsoring a seat. So people, private, non-business people will give us money at the courtyard and get a little plaque with their names on the seats, which they can't always manage to book them if it's sold out or whatever, but, you know, or they can, like people put on benches, put plaques in memory of people on benches. You can do that with our seats at the courtyard. So it's always commercial with sponsorship.
Great. Now we've touched on it briefly, but what is match funding?
So if you're applying to the Arts Council, for example, grants for the arts, there are other categories of funding with the Arts Council, but grants for the arts would be mostly what you would come into contact with, which is grants up to
15,000?
Yeah, that's
up to
the small one,
15,000,
up to 15,000
and then the
is
big
small.
one is 15,000 or over.
Exactly, yeah. So they're both grants for the arts. The one that's over is normally up to 100, but 15,000 takes a 6-week turnaround, and the other one takes 3 months. So you go over 15 grand, and then you're looking at a longer all, but it's a much bigger application. The Arts Council like to fund a percentage of your total budget. It varies and it's negotiable. Basically, the more other funding you can get in, the better, and that's what they call match. So it doesn't necessarily have to match exactly. It doesn't mean that they pay 30 grand and you get 30 grand from Heritage Lottery Fund or whatever. But you bring in match funding, so it's funded by other bodies. Yeah.
Great.
There's also support in kind. Have you heard of this? So your funding would normally be made up from a few different strands. One would be public funding, such as the Arts Council. You match funding from other bodies, such as the City Council or Elmley or somebody else. And then you can have private sponsorship as well, or commercial sponsorship, and also ticket sales, obviously. But then, and so that's all sort of hard cash, if you like. Then you have what we call support in kind, which a lot of people do nowadays. So, for example, if Feral were doing a production, then we would always get what we call support in kind from the Courtyard or the RNC, in terms of they don't give us any money, but we do get the use of their resources. So we would often here we would record our soundtracks here, we would often rehearse here, we would even do shows here, and the publicity would be put through all of the music text database and everything. And we would use you guys, we would use you guys as runners or whatever to help us with the shows. And likewise at the Courtyard would give us publicity, rehearsal space, sometimes technical support as well. That's support in kind, where they don't actually give you money, but there is a monetary value to it, so you have to cost it up. So if in your budget rehearsal space would cost £5,000, then that's part of your budget. You have to say in the budget that your expenses are for rehearsal space £5,000, and it's covered by the support in kind, which is worth £5,000. So it balances up.
When applying for funding, which organisation would you try first?
Well, again, it depends on the project. Our default is the Arts Council, because that fits with what we do. So for Feral, we would always go for grants for the arts. We would tend to go for Elmley, and we would go for the Dave Barclay Community Fund. We would try many others. So for us, track record.
Part of the Arts Council funding.
No. The Arts Council. Yeah, the Arts Council specifically grants for the arts.
Yeah.
For us, or national portfolio status, which is for companies who are established and come under the Arts Council wing to a point where they are regularly funded. They used to be called regularly funded organisations. So that they know they've got money for 3 years, basically, and they have a loose programme within that they can restructure. So, yes, our default would be Arts Council, but it depends on the project. It might not be. It might be very much a city project, in which case go to the City Council. The County Council don't have any money left anymore, so there's no point applying to them. In fact, their fund doesn't exist anymore. So we used to, Feral used to get money every year from the County Council, but that's gone now. It's no longer a possibility. Or if you were applying for capital from somewhere, then you would look for the right funding body that was going to supply money for equipment and that sort of thing. You just have to tailor make it. Yeah?
Great. Yeah. Our next one's quite juicy. Because we've done a hypothetical budget for our singing performance in March.
Yeah.
Would we be able to show it to you, and
Yeah, sure.
would you be able to give us your thoughts on it and any sort of constructive criticism?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Great. And then the final one is
What career paths do you think would be suitable for CCNI?
What career paths?
in this sort of
In the creative industry. Wow.
because like Cara said last year, you had a very clear idea with Kyla
Yeah.
that she should be in production. So.
Yes, I did. I worked with Kyla very closely, and she did a lot of work experience with me, which I haven't had with you two. Wow, that feels like a really separate, different question to the
No, it
funding
is very
bodies
different.
question.
Yeah.
That is
Let's-
juicy.
Do you wanna turn the
Let's
camera
have
off?
let's have a pause.